Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Females in Your Family Tree webinar sponsored by Ancestry.com. We've got a really great turnout tonight. At last count, we had people from more than 21 different countries tuning in to hear Mary's talk tonight. Our presenter tonight is Mary Penner, and my name is Juliana Smith. I'm the editor of the Ancestry Weekly Discovery. That's a free weekly email newsletter from Ancestry.com. Mary Penner is a genealogical researcher, writer, and speaker, and some of you probably recognize her name as a contributor to the Ancestry Weekly Discovery and other publications as well. If you do, you know that she has an amazing gift for teaching family history in a really interesting and enjoyable way. She's been researching her family history since she was 10, and she's an award-winning author. She's also a member of the board of directors of the Association of Professional Genealogists, and she specializes in New Mexico research and Santa Fe Trail traders. Say that 5 times fast. I've been struggling with it all day. Thank you so much for being here with us, Mary.
Thank you, Julie. I'm delighted to be with you this evening. I'm excited that so many of you from around the country and around the world are joining us here tonight on Ancestry.com to learn about some research strategies for finding females in your family tree. Well, let's get started. Sigmund Freud said this about women: "The great question that has never been answered, and which I have not yet been able to answer despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is what does a woman want?" Well, Sigmund Freud may have been perplexed about women, but family history researchers know what our women ancestors wanted. They wanted to be remembered. Their contributions to our ancestry shouldn't be overlooked. We often focus on the men in our family tree because they are simply easier to find than the women. Like Freud, we should be persistent in researching women. But unlike him, we're going to find some answers. You probably have some specific female ancestors in mind who are mysteries. We all have women ancestors who are mysteries in our family tree. Every ancestor we research is unique. Her circumstances and her life were unique. In this short seminar, I won't be able to specifically address all of your unique research problems, and sadly, some women will forever remain a mystery. But others are out there just waiting for you to come and find them. So I'm going to share with you some research tools that can help you crack the case on your mystery women. So what's in store this evening? First, we're going to identify some goals for female research. We're going to discuss 3 important research concepts that you need to understand in order to effectively research females. And those concepts are direct and indirect evidence and cluster genealogy. We're also going to examine 3 research strategies to help you find your mystery women: using vital records, examining female roles inside the family, and examining female roles outside the family. Finally, we'll conclude with a few tips and hints for finding females. We all have similar goals when researching our family females. We want to identify her given name and maiden name. We want to place her in the correct birth family, in other words, identify her parents. And we want to preserve her story and her place in our family tree. Keep these goals in mind when you put on your genealogy detective hat. When you set research goals, there's a basic process that you follow. First, you pose a research question. In this case, we're going to look at the example of Eleanor Klein. So our question is, who were Eleanor Klein's parents? That's a basic question that we're always asking when researching our ancestors. So after you've formed your question, then you have to consider various research strategies. You have to think about how you can answer your research question. Essentially, you ask yourself a bunch more questions, like where did Eleanor live and what records are available? Once you've thought about a plan to help you answer the research question, then you undertake the research. You gather the evidence from the records. In a perfect world, you'll find several documents that answer your research question. But we all know that the genealogy world is far from perfect. Asking the question is easy. It's the process that comes after you ask the question that bogs down our research and leaves our questions unanswered. In order to outline an effective research process, we need to understand the research concept of direct evidence. My colleague Tom Jones defines direct evidence like this: information that answers a genealogical question explicitly. Now remember our question: who were Eleanor Klein's parents? Well, here's part of a document, her death certificate, that directly and explicitly answers this question. You can see highlighted here the name of her father, John Fairfield, and her mother was Sarah Elizabeth Kirby. Now, genealogists love to find direct evidence to research questions. However, just because we have direct evidence that answers our question, it doesn't always mean the evidence is accurate. That's why you want to find as many sources as you can that answer your question. Nevertheless, this document explicitly provides an answer to the question of who were Eleanor's parents. So this is an example of what we call direct evidence. Now let's look at indirect evidence. Again, my colleague Tom Jones defines indirect evidence: information that appears to be relevant to a genealogical question but needs to be combined with other information before an answer can be formulated. In other words, you have no direct evidence answering the question, so you have to put together bits and pieces of indirect evidence. Let's assume that Eleanor didn't have a death certificate, or that the informant for her death certificate had no idea who her parents were and left those lines blank. And we can't find a single document that answers our research question with direct evidence. So you then need to reframe your question from who were Eleanor Klein's parents to who could have been Eleanor Klein's parents. Reframing the question helps you stop looking for non-existent direct evidence and encourages you to start hunting for indirect evidence. This research concept is crucial for finding female ancestors because often there is no direct evidence about her identity. So let me give you an example of using pieces of indirect evidence to answer a research question. So our question now is, who could have been Eleanor's parents? So here are 5 pieces of evidence that could be relevant to answering that question. First of all, let's say that Eleanor's oldest son is named Fairfield. Now, that's an unusual name and one that we need to notice. So we look around and we also notice there was a man with the surname Fairfield who lived and died in the town where Eleanor lived. So we track down his obituary, and it states that his parents were named John and Sarah Fairfield, and it mentions his surviving sister, Mrs. Klein. Now, for most of us, bells and whistles will start going off when we find that little gem. Yet we shouldn't stop there. That's still circumstantial evidence. We need to dig a little farther. So after some more hunting, we find a marriage record for John Fairfield and Sarah Kirby in 1856. We also see them listed on the 1860 census with a son named James. Eleanor, according to her death certificate, wasn't born until 1861, so it's no surprise that she wasn't listed. We find no other census records for Eleanor or James until they are adults. So looking further into John and Sarah Fairfield, we find a probate case in 1863 for John Fairfield that mentions 2 unnamed minor orphans. we can assume that Sarah was already dead. So you can see putting these pieces of indirect evidence together helps to answer our research question. No piece of direct evidence states explicitly that John and Sarah were Eleanor's parents. But putting the pieces together leads us to that conclusion. So I want to repeat one more time this definition for indirect evidence because it's so important. Information that appears to be relevant to a genealogical question but needs to be combined with other information before an answer can be formulated. So these two research concepts, direct and indirect evidence, are critical when searching for female ancestors. And as you can probably guess, most of our problems with women stem from the lack of direct evidence. This is why you need to understand the concept of indirect evidence and use it together, bits and pieces, to put together an answer. So we also need to understand another important research concept if we want to find our female ancestors. That concept is cluster genealogy. Emily Ann Kroom, in her book, Sleuth Book for Genealogists, defines cluster genealogy this way. Cluster genealogy is the idea that ancestors did not live in a vacuum, but in a cluster of relatives, neighbors, friends, and associates. Now, logic tells us that this is certainly true, yet we sometimes overlook the power of that cluster, of that network of family and associates to provide clues about our ancestors' lives. And for women, we have to use cluster genealogy if we want to find answers to our questions about them. Let's look at cluster genealogy in a different way. Elizabeth Shown Mills refers to the concept of cluster genealogy as a fan club, standing for friends, associates, and neighbors. She illustrates this concept with a target, with the research subject in the center. When we look only at our target subject, in our case, the mystery woman, we often can't find information on her because she didn't leave a paper trail. But if you expand your research to the outer rings, looking at her friends, associates, neighbors, and extended family members, then you might find your answers. In other words, to find records identifying your female ancestors, you frequently have to use cluster genealogy. You have to research lots of other people, all of those people clustered around the mystery woman, in order to find clues about her. So understanding these research concepts, direct evidence, indirect evidence, and cluster genealogy, is essential if you want to have success researching your female ancestors. So now we're ready to look at some research strategies. When researching women, you always want to start by tracking down vital records. Vital records refer to the records associated with life's major events, birth, marriage, and death. Vital records may be the only place where you can find direct evidence about a woman's identity. You typically will work in reverse order with vital records. So begin with death records, move backwards to marriage records, then finally hunt for birth records. Now, depending on when and where your ancestor lived, you're likely to have the most luck finding a marriage record. Record keeping for births and deaths were pretty casual affairs. Marriages, on the other hand, came with some binding legal obligations, so they were more likely to have been recorded. When looking for vital records, always remember to record every clue and the source. In other words, where you found that clue. Whenever you're tackling an identity problem for a female ancestor, just assume you may have to build an indirect evidence case, so it's a good idea to document all the clues you find along the way. So let's look at some examples of vital records and the information that they can provide about women. Now, death certificates can provide a host of direct evidence about our ancestors. You'll notice that this South Carolina death certificate for Martha Jane Leonard gives her date of birth, September 6, 1844, as well as her birthplace, which was Spartanburg County, and her date of death, September 16, 1916. Now, those are all important details. The best part of this death certificate is that it lists the names of her parents, Samuel Cathcart and Jane O'Shields. The certificate also notes their places of birth, both in Spartanburg County as well. You have to be cautious, though, about believing everything you read on a death certificate, especially the names and birthplaces of her parents. Martha's husband was the informant for this death certificate. The information about her parents might be correct or it might not be. Perhaps he never even met her parents. Perhaps he's just guessing about their ages. That's why it's a good idea to use multiple sources in order to verify these clues. There are some other vital records associated with deaths, including church death registers, town death registers, interment and cemetery records, and obituaries and death notices in newspapers. Often you have to use these kinds of records because most states didn't require death certificates until the mid-19th century, some even later than that. Now, if you're lucky enough to find a marriage certificate or a marriage record, it will almost always include the surname of the bride. Here's an 1880 New York City marriage record for Benjamin McDowell and Mary McCarthy. You can see that they were married on April 1st, 1880, by a pastor from the Nativity Church, which is an important clue. This particular marriage record also lists the names of the couple's parents. Here we see that the bride's father is named Thomas. We assume it's McCarthy since the clerk didn't bother to write his surname, and her mother is Margaret Reardon. So great clues there on a marriage certificate. Now, as you go farther back in time, you're less likely to find a marriage certificate. You might find marriage banns, which are records announcing the upcoming marriage, or you might find marriages recorded in religious or civil registers. This 1829 St. Louis marriage was recorded in a civil register. It doesn't list the names of the couple's parents, but it does include the bride's surname, Dorcas Bent. Another important clue is the denomination of the minister. You see it mentions the Presbyterian Church. You might be able to find out more about the couple by looking for church records for the Presbyterian Church. Don't forget to check for marriages in newspapers. We tend to think of newspaper announcements for marriages as a recent thing, but these marriage announcements here appeared in a Hartford, Connecticut newspaper in 1818. Now, notice that the marriages are listed from around the state. Different towns are named, and in some cases you'll see that the bride's father is listed. Now, birth certificates, like death certificates, are a relatively recent phenomenon. This 1888 Delaware birth record notes the maiden name of the mother, Lucinda Fisher. If birth certificates aren't available, you can hunt for baptismal records. Church records will often record baptisms, and they may just record births, as well as newspaper announcements. Again, don't discount the fact that a child's birth might have been in the newspaper, even a couple of centuries ago. So you're probably wondering, where can you get a hold of all of these vital records? Well, you can start by looking at the large collection of vital records on Ancestry.com. I like to search for vital records by using the card catalog. From the home page, you can click on the search tab and then click on the link for the card catalog. I usually search based on location. If I think an ancestor lived in Missouri, I'll type Missouri in the search box. That way the search will return all of the collections of Missouri records, and then I can easily spot the vital records. Now, vital records are typically maintained by the state where the event occurred. I like to go to this website, sponsored by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Here you'll see, you'll find a summary of each state's vital records and links to websites that offer more information. So you always want to check out the state's own website regarding vital records. You'll often find special information or forms for making requests for vital records. Now, the laws vary from state to state and from country to country for those joining us from foreign countries. You just need to check where those records are housed. And some states are very open about vital records. Other states restrict the records to immediate family members. Some states have time limits. You have to wait 50 years for a death record or 100 years for a birth record, that sort of thing. But other states are very open, and some of them even have digital images of vital records right on their websites. Missouri, Arizona are a couple of examples that do that. Now, vital records that aren't housed with state agencies can be in many different places. These are usually the records created before states began requiring record keeping for vital events. So you have to hunt for vital records in a variety of places. Check with the state agencies first. You may also want to look for records created at the local level, both town and county records. Look at church records, all of the churches that were active in the community. Look at cemetery records, newspapers, of course, state archives, state and local historical societies. Vital records can be found in all sorts of places. Whenever you're hunting for female ancestors, make every attempt to find her in vital records. So, what do you do after you've exhausted the search for vital records and you still can't find enough information to properly identify your mystery women? Well, when there are no vital records, you really feel like you're hitting your head against that brick wall. When you don't have vital records, you're left with some problems. You have women with no maiden name. You have women with no parent family. And worst of all, you have women with no known name whatsoever. Well, there's hope when you can't find vital records. You may be able to find some solutions to these problems with your female ancestors by using the research concepts I described earlier, cluster genealogy and indirect evidence. So let me show you how these concepts help with our next research strategy. The second research strategy to use for finding females is to examine her roles within the family. Map out her family cluster. Literally, draw a map of everyone you believe is related to her. We know that she was a daughter and a granddaughter. So ask yourself, what other family roles did she play? Was she a wife or a widow? Was she a mother or a mother-in-law? Was she a sister or a sister-in-law? Was she a grandmother or an aunt? Mapping out her family cluster and looking at the records created for and by her relatives may provide some answers about her. We know that every woman was a daughter and a granddaughter. So you need to ask yourself, who could have been her parents and grandparents? Look at the older people living nearby. Who were the neighbors? Who was buried near her? Notice the names of her sons and daughters. Were there any unusual names or consistent naming patterns? Daughters and granddaughters are often named in wills and probate cases. They may be named in deeds, and of course, check obituaries of people who might have been her parents or grandparents. Now, you can't examine every possible person in a community, so you have to use some critical thinking. Ask yourself, is this person a likely candidate to be her father? Is this person a likely candidate to be her grandmother? Think about your mystery woman and her role as a wife or a widow. If the female you're researching was married, you're likely to find the most information about her through her husband. Of course, you want to review all census records. Now, all members of the household weren't named until the 1850 census. So for the previous census years, you'll just see the heads of households, and then you'll see the number of women in the household and their approximate ages. The vast majority of heads of households were men, so those early census years make it difficult to identify the women, but not impossible. Take note of those little ticks in the column for the numbers of the women and their possible ages. Don't forget to look for state census records as well. Many states took their own censuses, and a lot of these are on Ancestry.com. Kansas state censuses, Iowa state censuses, and others as well. So they frequently took a census in off years, like 1895, 1905, that sort of thing. One census record we sometimes forget to review is the 1890 Special Veterans Census Schedule. Now, most of us know that almost all of the 1890 population schedules were destroyed in a fire. However, about half of the special veteran schedules remain. So when the census taker asked about veterans, if he was already deceased, the veteran's name was still recorded along with the name of his widow. On this example, you see Sarah S., widow of William Shearer. I've actually seen widows listed on this veteran schedule who had been married to two different veterans and outlived them both. Both of their previous husbands' names were listed next to the widow's name. Deed records are another source for spotting a wife's name. This deed from the 1820s mentions John O'Fallon and R. Caroline, his wife. Be sure to look at all land transactions, all deed records made by a woman's husband or a man who you think might have been her husband. Women were frequently mentioned. Now, even though women didn't serve in the military, at least not officially, you can often find them mentioned in their husband's military records, especially pension application files. This first example is for a Revolutionary War veteran. Now, even though his wife was already deceased at the time the veteran applied, he still mentioned her name. Notice it says, he then married Hannah Bosworth. This veteran also mentioned when and where they married. Now, these next three examples are from a Civil War pension file for the same veteran. And this pension application was made by his widow 15 years after the veteran died. You see, it says his first wife was named Charlotte Bohall. The soldier's second wife was Martha G. Morris. And the third wife, the widow applying for the pension, it notes that she married the soldier on August 26, 1861, at the house of her father, George Wise. All of these great clues about women were found in military records. City directories are another handy place to spot widows. Look at this New York City directory from 1816. We see Mary Banker living at 10 Leonard. Now look at the next year, 1817. We see Mary Banker again at 10 Leonard, but this time the entry mentions that she was the widow of Abraham. If there are city directories available in the locations where your ancestors lived, you need to examine every year because these entries can hold valuable clues. Even if your ancestors were rural, there are often city directories for nearby larger communities, and they often included some of those small rural towns. So try to hunt down those city directories. So another role that women often played was as a mother or a mother-in-law. If you know who your ancestor is, but can't identify his or her mother, you need to ask yourself, who is a potential mother? Notice all of the women associated with your ancestor. Who were the neighbor women? Court records can often hold clues about mystery women, and look especially at probate records and records of estate sales. I was once investigating two men with the same surname. I suspected they were brothers, but I had no evidence of that because I didn't know the names of their parents, and I couldn't find any records that directly indicated they were brothers. So I went page by page through probate records in the county where they lived, looking for any clues about them. Eventually, I noticed that both of these men bought a large number of items at an estate sale for a woman who had recently died. She didn't have the same surname as the two men, so at first I thought she was just a neighbor, or maybe she just had really good stuff that these guys wanted to buy. Then I started thinking about this woman, and I asked myself, could she have been their mother? I started investigating her, and eventually, using cluster genealogy and indirect evidence, I was able to conclude that she was indeed their mother. Her surname was different because she had married another man later in life. Also, look at military pension files for women's sons or potential sons. I found a Revolutionary War pension file in which the soldier mentioned his mother's maiden name, and he mentioned when and where she died. When you're thinking of women as mothers, look at all of their children. Don't just focus on your ancestor. You may need to research all of your ancestors' siblings and potential siblings in order to find clues about their mother. Look at this 1870 census record. Now, we all wish we could find a record like this. Notice Rebecca Fitzgerald, age 54, living in the household of John and Cynthia Irwin. Your first thought is, this Rebecca may be Cynthia's mother. And as it turns out, she was Cynthia's mother. But she could have been John's mother, or she could have been an aunt. Now, Cynthia had 5 siblings. If you were researching one of them and didn't bother to research all of the siblings, you might have overlooked this important clue about Rebecca. So you need to trace all of a woman's children looking for clues about her. Now we need to think of your mystery woman as a sister. Look at her siblings or potential siblings for clues about her. And if you see her associated with a man that has a different surname than hers, think of that man as possibly her brother or brother-in-law. Now this short obituary written in 1889 is packed with clues about a woman and her siblings. Let me just read it to you. Mrs. Sabrina A. Barker died Tuesday at the residence of her son-in-law, John S. Bratt, number 54, North 4th Street, aged 91 years. The deceased was married in 1829 to Eben Barker of Lansingburg, who died in 1859. She is survived by a brother, Samuel H. Arnold, aged 96 years, of Chicago, and the following sisters: Mrs. Charles Barnhart of Chicago, aged 92 years, Mrs. Erastus Hemingway of Chatham, aged 87 years, and Mrs. Frederick Van Alstyne of East Sand Lake, aged 86 years. Now, this is a fantastic obituary. We learn all kinds of things about Sabrina from this obituary, and we learn things about her sisters, connecting that family cluster. And one of the most important clues is the name of her brother, Samuel Arnold. It's likely that Sabrina's maiden name was Arnold. If your mystery woman was a sister, research all of her siblings and all of her potential siblings, those adults clustered around her that might actually be her brothers and sisters. So let's sum up some of the key things to remember about cluster genealogy and roles within the family. When you use cluster genealogy to help you find an elusive female, consider every possible role she played in her family. Look at this photograph and think about the relationships you see represented here. There's a grandmother, a mother-in-law, a sister, an aunt, and a sister-in-law. All of those relationships could hold a clue about the woman you're researching. Remember to focus on the men in the woman's life. Research them, and you may find her. Don't limit yourself to your direct line. Remember to look at all the siblings. And finally, think about using clues to put together an indirect evidence case. Now we're ready for our third research strategy, and that's examining roles outside of the family unit. Ask yourself a series of questions. Was this mystery woman a citizen, a community resident, a church member, a consumer, an employee, a club member, a student? You need to be thinking about other sources of records and information about her. So these are some of the places you need to check when looking for your mystery women. Look at court records, both civil and criminal cases. Examine every kind of court docket, journal, case file that you can find where your female was known to have lived. And don't forget to look at divorce records. Just because a husband is no longer in the picture doesn't mean he was dead. Now, in some states, early divorce cases were handled by the state's legislature, so you may have to look for clues in legislative session minutes. Other great sources of information about women in a community are diaries and letters written by others who lived where she lived. So am I talking about gossip? Well, you could call it that. But those faithful recorders of daily life often mention people, and you might get lucky and find some gossip about your ancestors in letters or diaries written by others. Now, those kinds of documents are usually at state or local historical societies. You might find them at local colleges or universities in their manuscript collections. And of course, if there are newspapers available from the time and place where your women lived, be sure to check those as well. Examine local churches for records. You might find membership rolls, church meeting minutes, confirmation records. Church records, as I mentioned earlier, are an important source for vital records. So in many cases where civil records don't exist, you can find details about ancestors in the records of the local churches. Continuing with considering roles she might have played outside the family, ask yourself, was she a consumer? You might find her name mentioned in store ledgers that exist for the time and place where she lived. Was she an employee? Women began working outside the home sooner than you might think. In the late 18th century, women started working in factories. Don't overlook the possibility that she might have had a job as a teacher or a factory worker, a secretary. Consider looking for any kind of employment-related records in the place where she was known to have lived. Was your mystery female a club member? There were clubs just for women. Some were religious-affiliated organizations. Some were charitable organizations. Look for meeting minutes, membership rolls, those kinds of things for clubs that may have been operating where your mystery woman lived. Now, many women did attend school, even if it was just for a few years. In the latter part of the 19th century, women often attended special business schools, and some even went to college. Look for school attendance records, yearbooks. Again, consider the place where your ancestor women lived and look and see what kinds of records are available there. So, to sum up what to look for when considering a woman's roles outside the family, you need to think about location. What are the records available where she was known to have lived? Now, you don't have the answer to that off the top of your head, so you're going to have to do some research. You're going to have to hunt and see what records are available based on location. Think about opportunities. What opportunities were available to her? Were there places of employment in her community? Were there businesses in her community where she may have shopped? Those kinds of things. What was available to her? Were there schools in the neighborhood? Think about her circumstances. What events occurred in her lifetime? Did she have children that were born, that married, that died? Look for events that occurred in her lifetime and try and document the records associated with those events. Also look for events outside of her family sphere. Read some history about the location where she was living, what was happening in her community. Considering all the possible roles that she played outside of her family will help you focus on the types of records that you want to look for to help you find information about her. Now, I want to give you a few more tips about researching women ancestors. Be aware of names. Always consider possible nicknames for women. If you see her named as Elizabeth in one record and Betsy in another, you may be seeing records for the same person. And for some maddening reason, our ancestors frequently use their first and middle names interchangeably. One record might list her using her first name, and another record will use her middle name. So if you see a woman with two different names, don't jump to the conclusion that there were two different women. If you notice a middle initial, pay attention to it. Middle initials may be the first initial of her maiden name. And remember that her surname at the time of her marriage may not have been her maiden name. She could have been married previously. Pay special attention to the names of children, looking for patterns and clues. Also, you always need to consider the reliability of the informant providing information about your ancestors. Did they really know what they were talking about? For example, did your female ancestor's grandson who provided information for her death certificate really know the names of her parents? Or was he just pulling a name back from his childhood, a memory of a name? Related to that, don't assume that any record is completely accurate. always be a little skeptical and look for more evidence to complete the picture. Now, another valuable way to learn about tracing females is to study what others have done. Read case studies in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, in the New England Historical and Genealogical Record, and there are other genealogy-related journals as well. And these case studies will document how a researcher solved a research problem. And you may think, well, I don't want to read about someone else's research. It has nothing to do with my family. But you read these case studies so that you can learn their methods, learn how they reached their conclusions. Now, you can find these journals in your local genealogy library. Go to their website. Some of them have transcripts of or digital images of their old issues online, or you can buy single issues. And some of these issues have had as their focus finding female ancestors. So it's always a good idea to read case studies to learn about methods for solving problems with ancestors. And women ancestors can be such a challenge. These case studies appear frequently in these journals, so you don't have to look very far to find one that focuses on finding and identifying women ancestors. So some things that I want you to remember tonight. Remember to reframe your questions. If you ask questions that can only be answered with direct evidence, such as what was her maiden name, you may not be able to find the answer. Ask yourself questions that prompt you to look for indirect evidence. Remember to use cluster genealogy. Research all of the people around your mystery woman. Map out her cluster and think about her roles inside the family and her roles outside the family. Look for records associated with all of those roles. You don't have to have the name of a woman in order to use cluster genealogy. You just have to know that she existed, and you have to have an idea of who her family members were surrounding her. It's usually going to be a husband or a child or a sibling or a parent. There's going to be at least one person that you can start building her family cluster from. You don't have to know her name when you start out. Build a case using indirect evidence. You need to look for pieces of the puzzle that you can combine with other pieces to build a case for your mystery females. Building an indirect evidence case takes patience and perseverance. You can spend a lot of time on this, and you may never be able to find a specific answer to the problems we face with women. Those questions, what were their maiden names, who were their parents? But if you use cluster genealogy, if you build a case using indirect evidence, you may be able to settle on a likely answer. I want to close the presentation this evening by showing you some of my women ancestors. Each of these women, especially my mom there in the middle, played a role in my ancestral past. Without them, I wouldn't be here today. Think of the women in your family tree. Think of the women on your pedigree charts with no names, no parents. They deserve to be identified. I hope that I've been able to give you some ideas about how to rescue their stories, how to rescue their lives from obscurity and from just being a question mark on your family tree. So thanks for listening in this evening. I hope I've been able to give you some ideas. Julie, do we have some time for some questions?
I do have one question that I was hoping you were going to let me field.
Oh, go right ahead.
And that is one from Sandy, and this brought up a really good point. How can you search without a maiden name? Sometimes we get hung up on having that piece of information, that maiden name, even though we have all these other identifiers about the people in our family history. If you knew her first name and you know her age, and perhaps you know where she was from, a lot of times you can put in those pieces of information and put in other things. If you know the name of a sibling, in some cases with census records, you can actually add in and search using the name of a sibling. And when you put all those pieces together, a lot of times you will bring up only a few candidates, and you can narrow your search that way. So that was I thought that was a really great point to bring up.
That is great.
We do have some other questions. Judy wanted to know, why were women treated like property in the past centuries, much like slaves? It's almost like their maiden names didn't exist, and that's a really good point. That's one of the problems we face.
That is a good question, and they were treated sort of like property. There were laws in place in the past that were called the laws of femme covert. That's FEMECOVERT. Femme covert. You could research that law, but essentially it said that when women married, they basically lost all of their legal rights and obligations. It was like the women were merged into their husbands, and they no longer existed as far as the law was concerned. Any property or money that she had prior to her marriage became her husband's. Any property that she may have inherited or earned while she was married became her husband's as well. So women had no standing before the law as a married woman. Now, women who were single, I think the term was called sole covert, SOLE covert. Women who were single did have rights. They could own property. They could sell property. And this law persisted. Now it varied from country to country, but those laws were in effect here in America, in England, and other English-speaking countries, and other countries as well. And it persisted really into the mid-19th century. Various countries and states here in the U.S. began passing what were called Married Women's Property Acts, so that they could start owning property and having things that were rightfully theirs. So, yeah, Judy was right. Women were treated a lot like property. They didn't have any rights of their own, and that makes it very hard for us to find them in the records.
Hard, but not impossible. You gave us some great strategies. Okay, here's another question from Carol. When women immigrated to the U.S. with their husband or father, were their names always included on the passenger list of ships?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is no. They were not always included, and the later passenger ship records, I would say probably from the mid to late 1800s on, you're more likely to find the women's names, but earlier records, and even some later records, you'll often see the husband's name on the passenger list followed by "and wife" or "with 2 children." A lot of times they were not named, and sometimes it would just be under her husband's name, Mrs. John Smith. I remember I was looking just the other day at some passenger lists, and I saw an entry for John Carson and lady. Now, I was wondering, who was this lady? Was it his wife, his mother, his maid? I don't know who the lady was. Another thing related to that is, for your immigrant ancestors, I think the year was 1906 when the immigration laws changed and became much more stringent. But prior to that time, you'll find very few naturalization records for women or children, because if their husband or father, who was an immigrant, became a citizen, then the women and children automatically became citizens as well. So you won't find, if you had a husband and wife both immigrated at the same time, you'll find an immigration or a naturalization record for him, but you won't find one for her.
Yes, that's a good point. Also, one other thing, too, I had heard, too, that Italian women, and this might actually be a helpful thing, sometimes Italian women, even when they were married, would travel under their maiden names. And they were also recorded in a lot of records using their maiden names, and that's true of several other nationalities as well. So it's worth investigating ethnic genealogical societies and reading how-to books for your ancestors' particular ethnicity and learning about those type of customs.
That's true, and that's a good point. And I do a lot of Hispanic research here in New Mexico, and I love that custom of
yes.
women being identified with their maiden name even after they are married, and it's a great help. Any other questions?
Yeah, sure. We have a question from Kiana. She asked me, if you have a general idea of where your relatives are from, would it be wise to travel to that state or country, or county rather, and research through library archives?
Well, I mean, we'd all love to spend all of our time dashing around the country researching on site, and there's something to be said for walking up to that tombstone and, you know, seeing the old homestead. And we can make some of those journeys, but we can't go everywhere. So the first thing that I always do when I'm researching at a location that is not where I am is, you know, you can check Ancestry.com for all the great records, go to the card catalog, search by place, but you can also check the local genealogical and historical societies where your ancestors were living, see what publications they have. Most of these organizations have websites. Another great source that I always use when I'm researching in a new place is check the local public library. See what resources they have. Many libraries are really hip to the fact that there are so many genealogists out there always calling them, asking for information. A lot of them are putting indexes online, like obituary indexes out of their newspapers. So hunt down a website, or you can phone a local library, public library, where your ancestors lived. Also, check the state archives in that state where your ancestors lived. Many of them are putting records online, and many of them have special sections on their websites geared toward helping genealogists and family history researchers. Also, learn how to use a great tool. It's called interlibrary loan. If you see something at a state archives, a state library, or at a local library, check their interlibrary loan policy. And what that is you find a book or a microfilm or a microfiche or something that you want to look at, and you get the information on it. You go to your local public library and you tell them what you're wanting, and they will request that other library send the document or the book or the microfilm to your home library, and you can research it there. And of course, always check the Family History Library catalog, as we know that they have microfilmed so many records that are useful for our research. And they have their catalog online at familysearch.org, and you can look at them and request that microfilms be sent to your local Family History Center. So there's a lot of ways that you can have the information brought to you, and you can go out, and a lot of it, don't expect everything to be on the Internet. There's a lot on the Internet, but there's a lot sitting in repositories locally, but you can still access some of that information through interlibrary loan, through looking at their websites, without having to travel every place. But definitely, when you can, build in a travel plan, because there is nothing like going.
Yeah, there's no thrill like that.
That's right, seeing those grave markers and so forth. So.
Touching the actual documents. But anyways, I really want to thank you, Mary. You've given us some fantastic strategies, and I think people are going to really make some headway on their research. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm glad that so many people were able to log on. I appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.